I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia and the Duckworth Library at Young Harris College. Our guest today is Ralph Reed, a legendary political strategist, a campaign advisor to presidents, and an author. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you, Bob. It's good to be here.
Good. We'd like to talk to you, Ralph, about your career and your role in building a powerful coalition of evangelical voters in the country. But first, we'd like to find out all we can about Ralph Reed.
Well, I'm the son of a Navy flight surgeon who served on an aircraft carrier in Vietnam. He was at the Gulf of Tonkin in August of 1964, and me and my two siblings grew up on Navy bases from Pensacola to San Diego to Norfolk, and I was born at Portsmouth Naval Hospital. My dad discharged out of the Navy after his service and went into private practice in his hometown of Miami, Florida. And that was really where I first got interested in politics. In 1972, when I was 11 years old, both the Republican and the Democratic conventions came to Miami Beach. And, there was a time in American history when both conventions would meet in the same city, Chicago or New York or someplace like that, Philadelphia. But it's been pretty uncommon in my lifetime. And living there, it was just an exciting time. I mean, it was the first election that 18-year-olds had the right to vote in all 50 states. The Vietnam War was still going on, so you had the hippies and the yippies and the anti-war movement, the McGovern campaign. It was fascinating, and I watched, this is of course before CNN or Fox News, they had gavel-to-gavel coverage on the local TV stations in Miami, and I stayed up until, I think when George McGovern gave his acceptance speech at 2 in the morning, I think I was watching. And I kind of got hooked, and I think that it really went back earlier than that, although I didn't know it at the time. I don't know exactly why my intellectual interests at a formative age took this direction, but my mother was very big into reading. She was a big reader, and she wanted each of her children to be avid readers. And she would take me to the library. Of course, now you download it on your Kindle, but she'd take me to the library, and she'd get a book, and I'd get a book. And I can just remember going into the library where they would have the shelves of, sort of the new hot books or however they did it, and being drawn to political biographies. I think there was a biography that came out around that time. This would have been in the 60s, When the Cheering Stopped, which was about Woodrow Wilson's stroke and then his wife basically becoming co-president. And I read biographies of Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt and many, many others. And so I was really captivated by, great leaders who had changed the direction of history. Mm-hmm. And I think when that combined with politics at a very interesting and turbulent time, because I sort of came of age politically in the 60s, even though I was very young, mm-hmm. I was very interested in it. And that's how it all began for me.
Mm-hmm. And then you moved to Georgia.
Correct. That was a big change. To go from an international city of, Cubans and Haitians and Jamaicans and Costa Ricans and Nicaraguans, any Latin American country that either had turmoil or instability or at that time a communist takeover, they'd end up in Miami.
Right.
And I went to public school, and I would guess that my public school, I could be wrong about this, but I wouldn't be surprised if my public school wasn't 20% Jewish. Mm. And then I moved to Toccoa, which was a little textile town in the North Georgia mountains in the Bible Belt. and it was basically Georgia back then was a biracial society. I mean, it was white and black. And this is kind of hard to believe, but in Stevens County, where I grew up after we left Miami, they had been able to extend segregation, as a lot of rural counties did after Brown v. Board, by having a city school system and a county school system. And the black children went to the county schools and the white children went to the city schools. Not that there wasn't some overlap, but it avoided total integration. And that had only come to an end a few years before I got there. So it was a very big change. And I don't think I had any idea when I moved to Toccoa how much of an impact it would have on my life. But I don't think that I ever would have understood evangelicalism or the evangelical mind had I not had that experience. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, we were a town of 10,000 people, and there was a Baptist church on every corner. And, I got to know a lot. I was not at that time, I was raised in a Christian home, but I had not made a personal faith decision at that time. But I got to know a lot of people who were very, very devout, Bible-believing evangelical Christians in that small town. Mm-hmm. And they had a big impact on me.
Then you came to the university.
Correct.
What was life like on the campus here?
Well, I had a great time. I got a great education. Number one, I chose history as my major, thinking that it would be a good pre-law major and I would go on to law school. That ended up not happening. But I had some great professors and I got a terrific education, to such an extent that that didn't turn out that way either, but I decided on an academic career and wanted to be a history professor. But in terms of my political involvement, I ran for and was elected chairman of the College Republicans at the University of Georgia, I guess in the spring of 1980, around the time that Reagan was running for the Republican nomination. And we were, of course, the largest state university in Jimmy Carter's home state. He was the president. And I was a Republican. Had never been for Carter in the first place because I was a Republican. I voted, I didn't vote, but I supported Gerald Ford. But now it was kind of a big deal because it was fairly clear that Carter would have a tough re-election, and we were in his home state helping to lead the charge for Reagan. The day I got elected chairman of the College Republicans at the University of Georgia, we had 35 dues-paying members. By the time we got back in September for the fall semester and did our membership drive, we had over 500 members, and we were one of the largest organizations on the entire campus. And that wasn't due to my organizational brilliance. It was due to one man, and that was Ronald Reagan.
Mm-hmm. Didn't you interrupt your education to go to Washington?
Yeah, that was, of course, that fall when I was chairman of the College Republicans, Mac Mattingly was elected to the U.S. Senate. I had worked for Mac, obviously, because he was our Senate nominee, guy who was given zero chance of winning that election. And, of course, won in a shocking upset. And that's a night I'll never forget. And when Mac Mattingly was elected, I was part of the first group of interns that he had in his Senate office. And, most people use their Senate or Capitol Hill internships to, experience the nation's capital and, go out and party a little bit, and have a good time. I was under the false impression, but an impression which I held with such conviction that it bordered on absolute certainty, that I was actually a member of the senator's staff. Not that I was an intern, but that I was an actual member of the staff. And I was a little crazy. I mean, I would back then, I don't know what goes on now, but they would print the congressional record for that day's debates. And the congressional record would be bundled and dropped off at the offices, basically outside their doors. And if the session hadn't gone into the evening, that would be done in the early hours of the morning. I would get the copy of the congressional record and I would take the subway back to my little apartment out in Alexandria. And on the subway and on the bus, I read the congressional record. And my guess is very few people did that. And I would literally read the debates. So when I got to work the next morning, I knew more about what had gone on the floor of the Senate than most people who were actual staffers. And I'd get to work at 7:30 in the morning, and sometimes I wouldn't leave until close to midnight. And then after the internship came to an end, I, again mistakenly thinking I was a staffer, went to the legislative director and requested that I be allowed to stay on after my, free. I just wanted to be there, And he came back and lobbied for me, but he came back and said, you're an intern, Ralph. So at that point, I went over to the Republican National Committee, and I was at the College Republicans. But it was a very exciting time, because while I was there for my internship, the Congress passed the Reagan budget cuts, what we knew then as Graham-Latta, and the Reagan tax cuts. And I was in the House chamber, in the gallery, when the House passed the Reagan tax cuts, and I was in the Senate gallery when the Senate passed the Reagan tax cuts. I'll never forget it, because Elizabeth Taylor was then married to John Warner, the senator from Virginia. And Elizabeth Taylor came into the family gallery, where family members of senators sit, during the vote. And there was quite a bit of buzz, in the gallery when she came in.
What were your duties with the college Republican National Committee?
Well, I was, I had the title of National Projects Director, which sounded more important than it really was. But what I did, actually, my job, beyond just going around and organizing college Republican chapters around the country and teaching college Republican field training seminars, which we did throughout 1981 and 1982, we were training thousands of students so that they could go out and organize and get young people registered and so forth. It was a very exciting time politically to be a Republican on the college campuses, because Reagan, who was the oldest man to ever be elected president, elected at the age of 69, got his strongest support among 18 to 24-year-old voters. So the youth voted for the oldest guy to ever be president by the biggest margin of anybody. And, we know from political scientists that political socialization, at the time that you're casting your first ballot, is critical. If you track people's voting patterns throughout their lifetime, they will usually, there are exceptions, but the overwhelming statistical evidence is that they'll vote that way the rest of their lives. So if you came of age and cast your first votes for FDR during the New Deal, you probably voted that way the rest of your life. So this had a huge impact on my generation. And, I think that there could be an interesting book written, about the Reagan youth generation, and how those of us who had grown up during Vietnam and Watergate and seen Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy and John F. Kennedy assassinated, and seen what stagflation and what Carter later referred to in his malaise speech as sort of a sense that the country had kind of lost its edge. Reagan was a real critical figure for us. So one of the things we did, and I'm not going to get the date right, but it's at a certain point in 1981, and this was my job at the College Republicans, Soviet troops working in concert with the army of the Polish communist dictatorship, led by a guy named General Jaruzelski, as I recall, crushed the Solidarity Union uprising in Poland. And we launched on the college campuses a nationwide petition drive to call on Poland to become free. And so I went all over the country and organized these events, went to Chicago where there was a huge Polish population and organized support to help liberate Poland. You know, it seemed kind of pie in the sky. It'd be like today saying you were going to liberate Cuba or liberate Venezuela. But obviously through a series of events that we couldn't have anticipated, including, you know, the election of the first Polish Pope in the history of the Catholic Church and a lot of other things, Poland's free today. So it's kind of interesting that I began my career, you know, doing that.
Mm-hmm. You returned to the university, did you not?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I returned and finished. And by then, I had changed my mind from law school and decided that I probably wanted to become a college professor. So at that point, not that my studies weren't important to me, but they became even more important because I wanted to get into a good graduate school. And then also after I got back from D.C., well, I guess it was prior to that, actually. I guess it would have been my freshman year. I interned in Zell Miller's office at the state capitol. And that was kind of interesting because Zell Miller was a Democrat who was getting ready to run against Herman Talmadge in the Democratic primary. I was a Republican, but I had a huge amount of admiration for Zell Miller, so I supported Zell in the Democratic primary, even though I was a Republican. Mm-hmm. Didn't vote for him because I didn't vote in Democratic primaries, but I supported him. Mm-hmm. And then once he lost to Herman Talmadge, of course, I supported Mac Mattingly.
Mm-hmm. What was your reaction to Senator Miller's conduct as a United States Senator?
Well, by then I had known Zell for, you know, since 1980. So I feel kind of badly because I never voted for him, but he's a dear friend. And because when he ran in, I guess, 2000, after Roy Barnes appointed him to the vacant seat formerly held by Paul Coverdell, you know, Mac Mattingly was running again, you know, and so I voted for Mac again, as I had in 1980. And as I no doubt would have had Zell been the Democratic nominee in 1980, because I'm a Republican. If I've ever voted Democrat, I don't remember it. I don't have any recollection of voting Democrat.
You're a yellow dog Republican.
I was shortly thereafter elected chairman of the Georgia Republican Party in 2001, but I had great admiration for Zell and always had. Even though he and I disagreed on a lot of issues, I liked him as a man, as a human being, and I thought that he was a great leader for the state. And again, didn't agree with him on a lot of issues, but thought that he was a very talented and gifted and capable guy. And of course, he was also from the North Georgia mountains, so that was something I could really relate to. Mm-hmm. So I got along very, very famously with him when he was in the Senate, and every now and again when I was in Washington, I would go by to see him. Mm-hmm. And one time on one of those visits, you know, I never tried to lobby in that sense his, you know, political convictions. I mean, I got the feeling that he kind of danced or marched to his own drummer, you know, and that's probably an understatement. I mean, Zell had a way of doing what he wanted to do, but I did go by and see him one time, and I think we were just chit-chatting, and I said, you know, Senator, I said, I would be remiss, given the position that I now hold as head of the Georgia Republican Party, if I didn't tell you that if you ever decided that you wanted to become a Republican, that you would be welcomed with open arms, and we'd be honored to have you. And he said, well, he said, if I were a younger man, he said, I might consider it. He said, but at this point in my life, you know, it's kind of hard to teach an old dog new tricks. He said, but if I were younger, I might do it.
Before we leave your academic career, I think that you went ahead and got your PhD at
I did, at Emory.
University. Mm-hmm. So what happened after that?
Well, first of all, I have to say, as I said about the University of Georgia, of my time at Emory, I got an incredible education. Emory University is an outstanding university, and I was privileged to study under Dan Carter, who has written sort of the definitive biography of George Wallace. I believe won the Bancroft Prize for his account of the Scottsboro case in Alabama in the 1930s, very famous case involving what were, probably, I think Carter proved almost certainly false charges against some African American young men. And my full intent was to teach. And I was working on my dissertation and was wrapping it up and was in the process of applying for teaching jobs when my phone rang out of the blue. This would have been in September of 1989. I went to Emory in the fall of '85. So this is 4 years later and I'm finishing. And it was Pat Robertson. And he said, you live in Atlanta, right? And I said, yeah. And he goes, well, I'm going to be having a meeting in Atlanta, I can't remember when, the following week or whenever it was. And he said, Jerry Falwell's closed down the Moral Majority, and I've had to spend the last, year or so getting things back in order at my ministry. But I don't want the effort that I made when I ran for president to come to an end, and I'm going to launch a new organization, and we're going to, just coincidence, we're going to have the meeting in Atlanta, and I'd like for you to come. Now, previously, I had been seated next to Pat Robertson at a youth event connected to the Bush 41 inaugural in January of 1989. And I had probably shaken his hand one time, but really did not know him at all. And I proceeded to tell him that I thought that his people had made a lot of mistakes when he ran for president, because when they went into the caucuses and took over, including here in Georgia, by the way, they purged or slated out a lot of people as delegates who were conservatives and in many cases Christians, because they had supported other people, whether it was Paul Laxalt or Jack Kemp or somebody else. And I said, I think that was a real mistake, because if you want to really impact the party, you can't just do it with an insurgency. You got to have some people in the establishment to be on your team too, or they're going to take you down. And I never thought I'd see him again. These were just my views, offered pretty transparently as somebody who admired him. And at the end of the dinner, at the inaugural, he said, hey, come here, I want to talk to you. And we walked down the service corridor to the banquet kitchen to a service elevator where he was going to leave. And he said, look, I'm going to start a new organization that's going to take the evangelical Christians and teach them to be as effective as the labor unions or a lot of other organizations, and I'd like for you to consider coming to work for me. And I mean, I was totally floored. I mean, I met the guy for an hour. And I said, well, I can't. I said, Pat, I'm very honored. I said, but I can't come and work for you because I'm finishing up my PhD at Emory, and I've got to finish. And my wife is pregnant with our first child, and I've got to get a teaching job. And he said, well, maybe we can work together anyway. He said, why don't you put together a memo on I've been impressed by some of the things you've said tonight. Why don't you put together a memo on how you think I ought to organize this organization and send it to me? And the elevator doors closed and he was gone. And so I went back to Atlanta from the inaugural, and I wrote that memo. And as I wrote the memo, I started to get excited, because I started saying, well, you ought to do this and you ought to do that. And the point of the memo basically was that here you had this huge group of between 20 and 40 million evangelicals. How many of them there were depended upon how you asked the question. How many of them were politically engaged and voted depended upon the election year. But it was one of the largest, if not the largest, single constituency in the electorate. But they were relatively politically unsophisticated. And the argument that I made in the memo was that if you could build an organization that mimicked a political party, that is to say they had state organizations, county organizations, precinct organizations, vote goals, voter registration, get out the vote, and you built a systematic, disciplined, hierarchical structure that maximized their full potential, that you could change the direction of the country and do it with relative ease given the size of the vote, if you just could move the needle. And so I typed this whole thing up, sent it up to him in Virginia Beach, didn't hear a word, nothing. Not a letter, not a phone call, nothing. Until that phone call in September of 1989. And so then I went to the meeting. It was at the Ritz-Carlton downtown. And I went to the meeting and I sat at the end of the table, and he introduced me to everybody as the first staffer of this new organization and hired me on the spot in front of all these other people. So I went back to my little apartment over in DeKalb County and I told my wife that we were moving to Virginia.
So how did you go about setting up this organization?
Well, I mean, it was kind of 3 yards in a cloud of dust. We had the old Robertson for President lists, some of which were really good, some of which were not good. We had a list of about 3 million people who had asked him to run for president. And that list wasn't particularly good because it was so big, and by then it was fairly old. List work was not as sophisticated back then as it is now. But we had a donor and activist list that we culled down to about 134,000 names. And we mailed and phoned that thing probably 10 or 20 times and ended up with our first 40 to 50,000 activists and donors. And then I came down here to Atlanta and met with a couple of donors and picked up about $20,000 so that we could turn the lights on. Pat wrote a personal check for, I think, as I recall, about $30,000 to drop the first direct mail piece. And the money came in. I mean, initially in a trickle and then ultimately in a torrent. And but as long as Bush was president, we were just kind of going out there organizing, training, building our state organizations. It wasn't until Clinton won in '92 that we really exploded. We probably went from 250,000 members to 1 million members in the 6 to 9 months after Clinton was sworn in. Kind of like you're seeing with Obama now. It's the same kind of thing. It's always the reaction to the other side winning that seems to spark it.
So you moved the evangelical movement from the pulpit, as you say, to the precincts.
Yeah, I think it was part of the ongoing maturation of the social conservative movement. Falwell and Robertson were sort of the booster rockets. Falwell much more prominently at first because he was head of the moral majority. They were really the trailblazers, along with a lot of others like Tim and Bev LaHaye, James Robertson, a lot of others, too many to name, really. And they issued a clarion call to evangelical Christians who had really been in self-imposed political exile since, roughly the Scopes trial of 1925. Had not really been an organized political force. And I think what I was trying to do was take the constituency that they had awoken from a slumber, and instead of it being a preacher-led movement, most of the state chairmen of the moral majority were pastors or preachers. I don't think we had a single pastor or preacher who was the head of our state organization. What we looked for at the Christian Coalition was a highly respected, politically sophisticated Christian businessman or woman who could raise money and hire a state version of me, who then went around and organized. And we wanted to have chapters in every key county in the state, and we wanted to have precinct chairs in every key precinct who were knocking on doors and registering people to vote, and then we wanted church coordinators in every evangelical church in the state. And we weren't able to achieve that everywhere, but in a lot of states, we ended up with very strong organizations.
A third party?
Not really. We were sort of strongly anti-third party in the sense that, I don't remember Pat and I ever talking about this, but through my historical training at Emory and at the University of Georgia, I had studied third party movements. The populists, the progressives, the anti-saloon party, the anti-slavery parties. And what happens to third parties in our system is their agendas get adopted by one of the two parties and they die. So the anti-slavery parties of the 40s and 50s get absorbed into the Republican Party and they go away. The populist movement ultimately gets absorbed into the Democratic Party through the fusionism of William Jennings Bryan's candidacy. And same with the progressives. The Bob LaFollettes of the world get folded into a Wilson-led progressive Democratic Party. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt tried to do the same with the Republican Party. It didn't really work. Then he tried to run as the Bull Moose Party, again, a progressive third party. All he succeeded in doing is electing Wilson. So third parties really don't work here in the sense of being long-term viable the way they do in a parliamentary system. In a parliamentary system in Europe or in Israel or other parts of the world, you could form a third party that got 10% of the vote, 15, 20% of the vote, and you could end up literally deciding which major party gets the majority because you're the power broker. And that's what the Orthodox parties do in Israel. But you can't do that in the United States. So what we decided to do, rather than be a third party, is to influence the direction of one of the two major parties, which in our case was the Republican Party.
So the Christian Coalition was based on social conservatism. The Tea Party, the present Tea Party, seems to me to be based on revolt.
Well, they're primarily concerned about government overreach, about government infringing upon freedom and liberty, and runaway spending, and I think for good reason. The social welfare state that was elected, roughly between the 30s and the 60s, is, as a purely fiscal and fiduciary or actuarial matter, is unsustainable. I think I may not have all the statistics right, but I believe when FDR signed Social Security into law in 1935, you began receiving benefits at the age of 65. That was at a time when the average life expectancy for an American male was 62. So half of all the males never received a benefit. Also at that time, there were 32 workers for every one retiree. So there was one retiree on the back of 32 workers. Now there's 2.5 to 3. There's one retiree on the back of 2.5 to 3 workers. And if you fast forward 50 years, deeper into the 21st century, there's going to be one retiree on the back of every 2 workers. You add that to the fact that the average life expectancy of an American male today is in their mid to upper 70s. And you can just do the math. It just doesn't add up. So it's a fiscal time bomb waiting to go off, and we've had multiple administrations and Congresses of both parties that have continued to kick the can down the road. There have been some attempts at fixes, like the commission that I guess Alan Greenspan headed back in the 80s under Reagan, where there was some long-term changes in the retirement age and some increases in the payroll tax. But all it's done is really delay the inevitable. The same, frankly, with Medicare. So the Tea Party folks are really concerned about the United States going the way of Greece or Portugal or Spain with this huge welfare state or benefit state that can't be supported, and a combination of high taxes and runaway spending and unsustainable debt essentially cratering the economy and endangering the American dream. And I think all of those are legitimate concerns. Now, what's interesting is at Faith and Freedom Coalition, which is the organization that I founded in 2009 and which I'm now the chairman of, we do a lot of work with the Tea Party movement. And what we found in our surveys is that about half of all evangelicals in the United States consider themselves to be members of the Tea Party movement. And about 2/3 to 3/4 of Tea Party members are social conservatives. They're pro-life, they're pro-marriage, they're pro-family, they believe in voluntary school prayer, they believe in God, and so forth. Now that's not the number one issue for them. You know, they're primarily concerned about jobs, taxes, spending, and the role of government. But there's no inherent conflict whatsoever between the Tea Party movement on the one hand and the social conservative movement on the other, and there's a huge amount of overlap. So it's really interesting.
So do you think the Tea Party will continue, or will those members return to the Republican Party?
Well, I don't think they've left the Republican Party. I'd have to go back and recheck the data, but I think about 92% of Tea Party members voted Republican in 2010. And as long as the Republicans are the party of fiscal responsibility, less spending, and holding the line on taxes and doing something to get this debt under control, I think they'll vote for him. But in the end, they're not ultimately loyal to either party. They're loyal to this agenda, and they're voting Republican because the Republicans are the closest to that agenda. I think that the Tea Party movement, like the social conservative movement, shows an uncommon political sophistication, especially for people who are often dismissed, as being less than savvy, in that they have purposely stayed away from a third party. They're a little bit like a modern day analog to the Perot movement. A lot of independents, a lot of libertarians, a lot of people previously turned off by politics, a lot of people who feel that it's a pox on both your houses. But whereas the Perot movement ended up being a third party, with Perot getting roughly 20% of the vote in 92 and about half that in 96. Back to my previous point about the futility of third parties, all Perot succeeded in doing was helping to elect and re-elect Bill Clinton. And that third party movement ultimately fizzled away. Whereas the pro-family movement remains very vital and vibrant, and I think the Tea Party movement will likely do the same.
Tell us about your new endeavor.
Well, Faith and Freedom Coalition is, for lack of a better term, kind of that fusionism of the Tea Party agenda and the pro-family agenda. We're pro-life and pro-family and pro-marriage, but we're also for limited government, fiscal responsibility, less spending, and lower taxes. And by the way, for a strong defense and a military posture sufficient to defend the homeland, pursue a forward strategy of victory against terrorism around the world, and support our allies, including Israel. So it's a much more comprehensive agenda than, say, the Christian Coalition had, although we were for all those things too. This is sort of proactively and self-consciously, we believe that economic and fiscal issues are ultimately family issues. Why do we believe that? We believe that, first of all, because of the roughly 25 million small businesses in America who employ 80% of the new employees in the economy, almost all of those are mom and pop family-run businesses. So if the economy is in trouble and if business isn't creating jobs, that doesn't just affect Wall Street, it affects Main Street, and it doesn't just affect General Electric and IBM, it affects a lot of families who run small businesses. The second reason is because we believe that the same principles that are found in the Judeo-Christian tradition as revealed in the Bible, and I want to stress the principles, not the theology. We're not talking about establishing a religion or an official church. That the Bible speaks to principles of money and management and finances and the economy as much or more than it does speak to marriage and family. So why would you have an agenda that deals only with marriage, family, and children's issues when there are so many principles of the Judeo-Christian tradition that speak how to run an economy and how to manage finances? We think chronic debt is something that is, clearly contrary to that tradition, whether it's practiced by a family, a business, or a government. So we think that there are in Scripture repeated invocations about the importance of remembering the rights of the poor and caring for the poor. The difference between us and those on the left who share our faith is that we think that that call is to the citizenry and the faithful, not necessarily to government. Government has a role, but it should be a limited role. So that's what Faith and Freedom Coalition is, and we're now up to around 400,000 members, and we're adding about 1,000 new members every day, either online or through the mail.
You've been a strategist for several presidents. Tell us about some of that.
Well, for Reagan, I was organizing on the campuses, and that was very important to the campaign, but it wasn't like I was interacting with Lee Atwater or Jim Baker. I was out there organizing young people. I think the first time I really got to know a president at all was under Bush 41, when I was at the Christian Coalition. Mm-hmm. And I worked, I was on, some advisory committee at the campaign. Knew Bob Teeter, who was a good man, Charlie Black, who was a key strategist, Mary Madeline. and did everything I could to help elect and re-elect him, and was proud to have done it. The only time I had it was unpaid but a virtually full-time job on a campaign was with George W. Bush in 2000 and 2004. And I got to know George W. Bush when his father was president. He was then the general manager of the Texas Rangers. We were becoming increasingly concerned about what we perceived. When I say we, I mean me and Pat Robertson. I was then at the Christian Coalition. We were becoming increasingly concerned about what we viewed as the ebbing political fortunes of the president. Pat Robertson did a phone-in poll. So this was not scientific. It was just call this one of these three 800 numbers and tell us, do you plan to vote Republican for Clinton or for Ross Perot in 1992? Can't remember exactly when he did this, but it would have been in the spring of 92 when Perot's movement was really exploding. And as I recall, it was 50% for Bush and 47% for Perot and 3% for Clinton. Now, again, not scientific, but if 47% of evangelicals who were watching Pat Robertson on TV were planning on voting for Ross Perot, that's like, really high blood pressure for a physician. There's bad things going on. And we were trying to get the attention of people in the White House about this and couldn't really seem to get any action. So I put together a memo, summarized the polling data, and I sent it down to George W. Bush in Arlington, Texas, because somebody had told me that if you wanted to get something to the president, you had to get it to Junior. That's what they called him. So I got a handwritten note back, something to the effect of, thanks, I totally agree, thanks for your support for my good dad. And then when I would go down to Texas, I would either visit with him or visit with Karl Rove, who was running his gubernatorial campaign in 93 and 94 after his dad lost. So later, when there were rumblings about him potentially running for president, I knew him quite well. I knew Karl quite well. And I flew down to Texas in April of 1997. I was about to leave the Christian Coalition, and he and I met in a hotel room in Austin. And it was me, him, and Karl. And I told him there, I said, if you decide to go, I want to sign, and I want to sign in blood. And I was part of it from the beginning and was honored to be a part of it.
Quick question about Florida.
Yeah. The recount?
The recount.
What about it?
Well, tell us about it.
Well, I just remember being in Austin on election night and CNN calling Florida for Gore. And I was standing in the lobby of the Stephen F. Austin Hotel with Mike Gerson, who was the then governor's chief speechwriter. And we all looked at each other and said, well, this isn't good. And of course, later they pulled it back. And then they called it for Bush. And I remember all of us, meaning staff, supporters, donors, we were all at this victory party, and we had heard that the governor was going to come out and give a victory speech at the stage that had been built right across the street from the Capitol in downtown Austin. So we were all running down the street to celebrate and to hear the governor's remarks. And as we were running or rapid walking down the street, it began to circulate, or people's cell phones were going off, that Gore had apparently pulled back his concession. And of course, we all stayed up, virtually all night. I probably got 2 hours of sleep. I went into the headquarters the next morning, and I didn't want to get in Karl's hair because he was obviously overwhelmed. But I stuck my head in and I said, look, I just want you to know I'm here. If you need me, let me know. And I said, are we going to be okay? And he goes, yeah, we're going to be okay. He goes, but there's two kinds of victories. He goes, a pretty one and an ugly one. He goes, this is going to be an ugly one. And I walked around the corner to find an office where I could make phone calls, and it just so happened that the little cubbyhole they gave me was right next to Ben Ginsberg's office, who was the legal counsel for the campaign. And there were all these deputy counsels who had a conference room where they had these speaker phones all going. And they had 3 of them, and there were groups of lawyers around each one, and they had rolling conference calls going throughout the state. And meanwhile, there were jets that were either being chartered or donated all over the country, literally, including in Austin, and people were running, even without any change of clothes, to get on these jets and fly to certain counties to be on the ground to represent the governor. And I remember sitting there watching all that, total chaos. And I'll never forget it. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen.
Let's break. I know you're in a hurry, but have you got time to tell us about your books?
Sure.
Okay.
I probably got, 5 or 10 minutes left? Yeah. I'll shorten my answers up.
No, just go ahead. Okay, you ready?
You want to do all of them or just the nonfiction?
I'm just going to give you an opportunity to say what you want to say.
Okay.
In addition to being a popular political strategist, you've also been a successful author. Tell us about your books.
Well, I wrote my first book, I guess in '94. I think the title was Politically Incorrect. And it was basically a defense of the Christian Coalition and an explanation of who we were and what we believed and what we really wanted. Then, of course, I think that book came out in the summer. A few months later, we took control of the House and the Senate. The Republican Party did, and we were allies of the leadership in both chambers. And I, as we headed into '96, I wrote another book, which was Active Faith, which was basically about what our agenda was for the country. Basically, if we could wave a magic wand and have what we wanted for America, what it would look like. And my argument was, and it wasn't particularly provocative, was that what evangelicals want for the country isn't that much different than what a lot of people want for the country. I mean, they want schools where children can be safe and learn, and where the teaching that they're receiving in the home isn't undermined or contravened by what they're learning at school. They believe that the 3 main institutions of socialization and enculturation are the church or synagogue or house of worship, the school, and the home. And they believe that all 3 of those should be mutually reinforcing rather than operating at odds. That's important to them, because by the time a child reaches school age, they're spending more waking hours with teachers and coaches than they are with their parents. They want safe neighborhoods free of crime and drugs. They want a government whose budget is balanced, with low taxes, that lives within its means and balance its budget every month, just like they have to balance their checkbook every month. They want safety from foreign aggression or foes, and they want to see marriage and family strengthened and innocent human life protected. Now, it used to be common to suggest that this was an extremist agenda. I think even the people who oppose social conservatives no longer think, or can no longer convincingly argue, that it's an out of the mainstream view. The other thing that I tried to say in Active Faith that I think is an important point is that in a free society, in a healthy, democratic free society, nobody ultimately imposes values on the larger society that are not held by the larger society as a matter of social consensus. It just doesn't happen. You could make an argument that it happened during Prohibition. That's a debatable proposition. But remember, that was a constitutional amendment that required a 2/3 vote in both chambers and ratification by 3/4 of the states. So by definition, whether it later failed or not, which it clearly did for all kinds of reasons that we don't need to get into, Prohibition was a national consensus on both the left and the right for different reasons. Those on the right were motivated more by moral concerns. Those on the left were more concerned about the underclass and the poor, who they believed were being exploited by liquor. So my argument was, if you really look at most social reform movements, whether it's the civil rights movement or women seeking the right to vote, or any other social reform movement, the labor union movement, none of them achieve all of their objectives, and none of them achieve objectives that aren't a matter of consensus, either through persuasion or moral suasion, or by winning elections over a long period of time. So there's really no, it was almost a Nicodemus or Gamaliel argument, where you basically go to the people who don't agree with you and say, look, if this isn't held by a lot of people, it can't succeed anyway, so don't worry about it. Then later, and more recently, I've shifted to fiction. And my first novel was Dark Horse, which is a book about, kind of ironic given what I've said about third parties, but it's about the first independent presidential candidate ever elected president. And I outlined that book and titled it when I was 15. And I sat down and outlined it. I outlined the chapters, and I wrote the first chapter. The opening scene of Dark Horse is the scene that I wrote when I was 15, not the actual words, but the scene. And after I wrote that first chapter, I thought, wait a minute, I'm 15 years old. There's no way I can know what this should be like, because I haven't been there. And so I had to wait 30 years, and then I wrote it. And I've written another one, and I've got a third one coming out soon. And I've enjoyed fiction, but I'm probably going to shift back to nonfiction here pretty soon.
And you're going to stay with politics?
That's what I would expect. I mean, I'm pretty committed right now to Faith and Freedom Coalition. Obviously founded it, and I'm chairman, and I think it's going to be a very effective organization, and will have a huge impact for years to come. So that's where at least my plans are to remain invested politically.
Good. It's been a great pleasure having you, Ralph.
Thanks, Bob. It's been a great honor, not only as somebody who's been privileged to be a part of a lot of great things, but also as an alum of the University of Georgia.
Good.